Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Cannon, and I'm the head of open research for Taylor & Francis. I'm delighted to be here at APE, pulling together this session on the humanities and how they're engaging with open research and open science. Taylor & Francis are the leading social sciences publisher, and while we've increased our provision in STM areas over the last 5 years, we're still highly engaged in humanities and social science areas. I'm delighted to be able to talk about some of the themes that we care about and give a platform to some of the groups that we've been working with, such as DARIAH. So whilst Taylor & Francis have been working on Plan S, transformative deals, and some of the new projects that Annie was talking about yesterday, we've also been working hard on our open research offerings. We have released our new data policies in 2018, updated our preprint policy last year, and there's lots of new exciting things coming for 2020. We understand that open research is different, whether you're an environmental scientist, a medic, or a political scientist, and we try to be aware of this in all the open research policies that we publish. The format for the session that we have following now is that we have 3 speakers who are each going to talk for roughly 10 minutes. After that, there will be an opportunity for a clarifying question or two, and from there, we'll move on to a more of a panel-style discussion about some of the themes that we'll raise. So humanities are deeply important to our society. They promote debate, critique, analysis, expression, and thinking. This is key to our journalism, politics, and economics, which are key issues of the day wherever you are in the world. I thought it was really nicely summed up by this quote: "Arts and humanities research helps to create the ideas that people live by." So what do we mean when we talk about open? As the library panel before lunch explained really nicely, it's not just about open access. It's more than just the version of record and about different kinds of research objects. Ultimately, open research is about changing the way that research is conducted. So there's lots of different ways that people can be open. One of the models that I've used quite a lot is this that you can see on the screen from Foster Open Science. They talk about sharing data, sharing code, sharing papers through preprints and open access, and then also open peer review. Open access has dominated a lot of the conversation that's been happening in open areas over the last few years, but as this model shows, there's a lot of other areas worthy of discussion and debate. I should also say that there's lots of other definitions of open science, including things like citizen science, but also registered reports and open science badges, and many of the other things that us as publishers are working on at the moment. So why is this different for the humanities? As I was saying, a lot of the focus and debate on openness has been around open access, full text in STM journals. Often this is paid for by funders and libraries through APCs. But the humanities looks different. It's not just about articles, there are books as well. And humanities isn't funded in the same way. So in order for humanities researchers to be open, they've needed to pull different levers in order to increase the transparency and reproducibility of their work. This is because full text to the version of record is not a scalable option. So if we want to revisit the Foster Open Science model, we might want to think about this slightly differently for the humanities. So firstly, what is data? So this is going to vary massively depending on which area of the humanities and social science you work in. And there's still a lot of debate around what is data for the humanities. The 2019 DARIAH conference was on the topic of humanities data, and we'll hear more from Erzsébet about the work that they do on this shortly. The second pillar in the Foster model is around code. And whilst there are some humanities researchers using and writing computer code to do their research, this isn't particularly widespread. However, if the purpose of sharing code is to help researchers either collect or analyze their data, there might be other things that people could be sharing in order to achieve this end goal. I think this fits really nicely with the Centre Open Science badge, which they call Open Materials, in addition to their Open Data and Pre-Registration badge. The third pillar was about sharing papers, and as I've said, full text open access might not be a largely scalable option, but the other side of that coin is about preprints. When you look at the major players in STM, Archive now has over 1.6 million preprints, and BioArchive about 70,000. Looking at the options in the social sciences, SocArchive and Humanities Commons both have around 4,000 preprints each. It's obviously quite a different story. And with that in mind, I'm really excited to hear what Mark's going to talk about in his section of this, talking about the new preprint server for political science that Cambridge University Press recently launched. Also, for humanities scholars, longer form ways of sharing their research is still really important. We have Margot with us, who's going to be talking about some of the developments in open access humanities books. The final pillar here is about open peer review. And while some of the top journals have been offering open peer review for a long time, this hasn't trickled down particularly far, especially into the humanities. I read a paper earlier this year which suggested there were 120 different definitions for open peer review, so there's still a lot of confusion around what people are talking about making open when they're talking about open peer review. I know there are trials underway with Scholar One manuscripts working with Publons, and there's also some STM projects underway looking at tying down some of the language that's being used around open peer review to try and give a bit more clarity in those areas. I trust this illustrates some of the challenges and opportunities for talking about open research for the humanities and the themes that we'll touch on in this session. So now to introduce the speakers that you'll meet shortly. So Erzsébet works as the Open Science Officer for DARIAH-EU. They provide European research infrastructure for the arts and humanities. She's responsible for fostering and implementing pathways to open access and open science that are meaningful and relevant to the arts and humanities researchers. This includes participation of European policymakers and training and advocacy, meta-research and experimenting with novel publishing and research evaluation practices. She received her PhD in cultural linguistics and has a background in scholarly communications. Next, Margot Bargheer, the head of electronic publishing at the University of Göttingen, who's going to talk to us about developments at university presses for open access humanities books. Margot originally trained as a graphic designer, has a master's in social anthropology and media, and is head of the Department of Electronic Publishing, the Open Access Publishing Fund, Göttingen University Press, and she's the spokesperson for the German-speaking University Presses Working Group. Finally, Mark Zadrozny is the executive publisher for Humanities and Social Science based in New York for Cambridge University Press. He's been at CUP since 2003 and has had a career of over 35 years in academic publishing with stints at both Macmillan and Academic Press. So as I mentioned, after each of the short speeches, they'll stay on the stage to set us up for their panel session shortly after. So now over to Erzsébet.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me today. So, being the obvious odd one out in the panel who is not representing a publishing house, this is especially a great honor for me to be invited to share some of my perspectives on open access and humanities. And I try not to lame too much with this, but so since our time is rather short, let me start right away with this brutally honest slide that highlights some of the special flavors of open access in the humanities. So first of all, we know that in the arts and humanities, a large portion of knowledge production still happens in specific local contexts, which on the one hand, it results in what we call bibliodiversity, that is the diversity of outputs in terms of languages, in terms of sizes, in terms of formats, which is a key value in arts and humanities research. But on the other hand, it also manifests itself in the fragmentation of the publishing landscape, or market, if you like, which market is anyway smaller than that of the hard sciences. So speaking of the market, another challenge we are well aware of is that the pay-to-publish models, where the costs of publishing is directed to the authors, will not work very well in disciplines where there isn't a huge amount of external project grant money funding going around. So this is an entry barrier for many humanities scholars in open access. In the morning session, the issue of career development and whether open access is supported over the prestigious publishing with prestigious publishers also came up. This is an issue in the humanities as well. And we also know that in the context of monograph publishing, all of these challenges are just got even more amplified in the dimensions of technicalities, in the dimension of finances, but also the career development aspect. So at my organization, DARIAH, we find it really important to navigate our communities through these complexities and find pathways to the open science and to the open research culture that are actually meaningful and relevant in the humanities context. As Matthew said, we are a European research infrastructure, which means that our main focus is developing an open infrastructure around humanities research in a European context. So in fact, the majority of our activities are not listed here, but in an open access context. So we do a lot of advocacy, but we also work on strengthening the voice of arts and humanities in policy debates about the future of scholarly communication or open access. Importantly, we do not only preach about open access, but we also provide infrastructural components, for instance, repositories to our researchers. We also collaborate with our sister infrastructure, Operas, to develop and connect some of the infrastructural components of SSH publishing. And by doing so, we are a little bit biased towards digital humanities, which means that we constantly seek ways in which we can make digital humanities tools and services to put them in use of scholarly communication. So the question we are asking is not only what are our needs in terms of scholarly communication, but also how we can contribute to the innovations in the field with our work. So in addition to the challenges I mentioned, and Matthew also mentioned in our talks, here is another thing that becomes pretty apparent if you are working with digital humanities scholars. That is, we no longer produce only scholarly outputs that can be placed on a bookshelf. To give you an example, here I copied a relevant part of a famously quoted, frequently used taxonomy of digital research activities in the humanities. And you can see it's a long list. It's far from being exhaustive. It contains artifacts, bibliographical data, markup, encoding, citations, databases, 3D images, maps, sounds, sheet music, software, whatever, and many other things that contemporary scholarship needs to accommodate. And here comes here comes the challenge, because what we see is that although these are very important scholarly objects to us, they are all too frequently, they are not considered as genuine publication items on their own. At least they are considered as auxiliaries or like appendices. But these are the places where scholarship really resides. So one solution to this problem is what we call the enhanced or the networked monographs. These are digital long forms of scholarship that interlink and embed multimedia, markup, or data with the text, with the publication text. You can see two examples here. The first of them is a multimedia bilingual edition of Rameau's Nephew, published by the Open Book publishers, which contains embedded soundtracks, as you can see, but it also contains notes as reflections, interactive materials, color illustrations. It's pretty exciting. But the second example is even bolder. It's a multimedia publication published by the Michigan University Press at their Fulcrum platform. And it literally embeds a 3D data model that enables to navigate the book in non-linear ways, and also gives access to the underlying data to navigate and interact with it. So these kind of innovations leverage on the full spectrum of the available technology, and as such they're able to open a much bigger, a much broader window on the scholarly process itself. They really transform the way we can conceive as the scholarly monograph in the 21st century. But on the other hand, they also bring lots of questions, new kinds of questions to the table that publishers and researchers should jointly figure out. Most of them has to do with establishing new evaluative cultures around these complex digital scholarships. But also technical questions, like who is going to host what, who is going to be responsible for the updates. Ownership issues can be pretty complex here. So there are many questions to figure out, and it seems that although the enhanced monographs are really a way to go, their production at this point requires a considerable amount of investment from both the scholar side and the publisher side. But a last point that I would like to highlight in my talk today is that pushing forward a more open, a more equitable research and publication culture does not always require massive investments or disruptive workflows. There are small changes that can make a big difference. For instance, introducing a proper green archiving policy is certainly one of those. But what I would like to show you today has to do with authorship, which is quite a sensitive issue in the humanities context, isn't it? We are all familiar with the allegorical figure of a humanist working in isolation on his or her single-authored monographs. So this is the model that is becoming more and more challenged in a digital humanities context, at least. And there is an ongoing discussion on how to better reflect the collaborative nature of research, also in the publications. How to credit the archivist, who, as insider knowledge, contributes a lot, in many cases, to data collections. How to appropriately attribute the developer who wrote the code underlying the research. And these kind of questions. And what we see, and I think this was an issue, a point of discussion in the morning session as well, is that once we see the demand from the early adopters, journal policies are actually a really powerful tool to establish and broaden good scholarly practices in this respect. So what you can see an example is from the MDPI journal Humanities, who decided to pay attention to authorship and contributor roles and implemented the so-called credit taxonomy that gives idea like about the different contributor roles in contemporary research. And what I want to say is that once a good practice is included in a journal's policy, then it really helps to make scholars think about their issues and establish a better culture, in this case, authorship. But I could have mentioned licensing or data citation as well in this context. So to wrap it up, it seems that we really have plenty of things to do to make open access. Let me rephrase, we still have plenty of things to do to make open access a reality in humanities at scale. But the challenges we have are shared challenges, are common challenges that we need to overcome together. And so open access has the potential, it's worth to do because it has the potential to solve many of the current problems of the scholarly communication, to bring a lot more diversity to the table, but it will never be successful without the deep understanding of disciplinary cultures. So in conclusion, I think I could only second Professor Ziegler's words from yesterday, who said that the beauty of the book should reflect the beauty of the ideas in scholarship. So let's be bold and let's experiment and work on this together. Thank you.
Are there any questions quickly for Erzsébet?
Oh, yes, sure.
Okay, so in that case, we can move on to Margot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm from one of the publishers that you would describe with a small p, and we are an embedded publisher. And we're actually so embedded that even my dress matches the corporate design of my press. You'll see that in a moment. Because I'll be displaying some approaches from our university press, which is Göttingen University Press, not because I think it's the most important university press in Germany, but because I think as an embedded publisher we can make a difference. And Wolfram's explanations this morning, I hope you can still remember them. When we work on open access as a library, the Göttingen University Press is one building brick in it. Not that we have to make all open science come true, but we do have to support it with whatever we do. This is not a cauliflower, this is a Romanesco. And I don't need to explain, because if you remember the brutal slide of Erzsébet, you still have in mind that whereas we have the field of STM, which I think most of you are working on as professional publishers, but the complexity of the humanities is basically just the same. It's just a matter of scale. And we do have more fragmentation, and the fragmentation is of course due to language and culture, but it is also to target groups, and it's the number of researchers that work in the highly specialized fields. This is an overview of the presses that I'm actually speaking for. So it's the Association of European University Presses and the German-speaking university presses, which is a group consisting of commercial presses with the brand of the university, but also other embedded university presses such as mine. Especially the embedded presses have a challenge. They have to navigate challenging waters. They have to fulfill a mission for their own institution. They have to operate against the fact that the publications then on the market of attention in vis-a-vis their peers, they have to live up to those produced by highly commercial or highly professional large partners. So they have to move and navigate in the scientific and global mainstream. And we all have limited resources. This is for the smaller and bigger publishers the same. Open access for some of the embedded publishers is a challenge, but I hopefully can persuade you that for us it's not just a challenge, it's actually our justification, and it's also our chance. This is a brief overview, and Roger is probably familiar with this number. Those are production costs from Anglo-American university presses, and I'll show you a slide why these costs are significantly higher than for those presses that I'm speaking for. But what you see is that there's a variety of costs involved. For the Anglo-American university presses, much of these costs consist of commissioning and being highly selective, because at the end of the day, our job is to bring the authors where they think that the party is taking place. And the party is usually taking place in costly arenas. And if we strictly stick to the sales revenue model, it means that much of the research that is produced with public money stays invisible because it can't make it through that bottleneck of publishing options, renowned publishing options. Unlike articles, although I think the book is one of the best success models of standardized knowledge and information dissemination, especially if you work in a library, you know that this is hundreds of years of dissemination chains in place, and they are really successful. But the article has made it to the digital world much easier because it's standardized packages, and these standardized packages rely on standardized dissemination chains. But for the humanities, this would mean that if we have these standardized infrastructures disseminating the results, they would limit the production and consumption diversity that we actually have in place for these research areas. So I was reminded I should define digital humanities once again from the point of view as an embedded publisher. So what's coming up to us? And because we are in a library, we are actually negotiating and discussing with our researchers on a one-on-one level, trying to make their research publishable in a way that scales for us. So they come with an epistémologie croisée, meaning they come with a high technical affinity, explaining to us what publishing techniques could be. They come with Jupyter notebooks, they come with R, all this stuff that I need to look up then, because I need to find a way that they can bring in these research results into their publications. At the same time, they are deeply rooted in their disciplines and they have a high field expertise, which means they have peers with high expectations. They come with various materials. Erzsébet mentioned this, I don't need to mention it again, which means for us, we can't host all these materials, but we need to think about horizontally integrated approaches. And we need to learn some confidence around their complex data that they're coming and want to see in their publications. And this, I think, this is not just true for the humanities, this is for everyone trying to engage and interact with results stemming from open science. These are emerging fields. So if we twist our workflows and our platforms, we might be seeing that we need to do this over and over again, because the publishing model won't stay static. And if I would have been asked, name a number, and I loved Janet's answer, 42, when do we have open science coming true? Open science is never going to be fully there because it's open, and that means it's a road, it's a process. At the same time, the careers are embedded in, let's say, rather conventional disciplines, and these conventional disciplines have pretty conventional expectations, which means that publications need to work on both ends. Whoops. This was brilliant. I don't know what I did. This is a manifestation of these highly successful workflows around books. This is in the basement of our library, me bringing books to the delivery area of books. The indexing is successful. If we look at digital environments, we are often stuck in the typical dilemma of any digital development is you can have only two of the three options. It's either fast and good, or it's fast and easy, or it's easy and good, but it's never all three of them at the same time, unless you sort of manage to reach economies of scale. And this is what I want to try to show to you, that as an embedded press, we are forced to find solutions that scale. This is a typical book for the discipline that I'm coming from, I'm a social anthropologist. This is a small society. They printed an anthology. At least they have a website. This is already rocket science for some of those humanities disciplines. But the book is only available through the commercial book trade. There's not a web shop. You can't look inside of the book. And then you have research in there that, for instance, consists of people working on digital performance and observing cults and spirituality in modern media. And so our researcher, Andrea Lauser, asked us if she could republish an article in that book. And because we understood where she's coming from, we said, you can also have the videos online. She rewrote the entire article. But then how does the original source embed the new potential? The traditional book is at its end already because it can't incorporate that there is enhanced versions. In this case, the videos are not sitting on our server, they are sitting on the server of the University of Hanover because they are specialized in audio-video material. This is my beloved example. Those are digital humanities scholars. It's one of the most cited handbooks these days. And we as a press were ready to do anything, and we were really scared what they would bring. What you see here is we issue DOIs for everything. We have, because we have the DOIs, we connected with altmetrics data. What Erzsébet just mentioned, that we, in digital humanities and open science, and I think this is true for all fields, also for STM, we do need to think about the role of authors, which means that we run this on a DSpace repository, that we can easily adopt the metadata model and have more fields with different roles for authors. And I think this is really important to have a platform where you have some flexibility to move along with the way that the research changes. The small H you see there, the red one, that means we can have live annotations at the publications on the PDF. So we thought maybe they come with, we want entity recognition. Those are automated processes to read names, persons, identify them. And luckily they said, no, we can't do this because we just don't have the time to go so deeply in our text, because we would be ending up with something like this. So this is not really artificial intelligence, but this is what our automated processes in entity recognition would deliver. And this is not really sufficient because, for instance, Gerald Spindler is one of the co-authors, whereas Foucault is one of the research subjects. And that shouldn't be on the same level, but here it is. So we decided against it, not just we as a press, but with our authors, with our researchers, and with our editorial board, because we said the added value for readers and authors is too small in comparison to the editorial effort it would mean to clean up such data. And then we thought, okay, they will bring things like this. So code, and where you can, the book is on reassembling the Republic of Letters. It's drawing on immense material from Bodleian library, but also from Göttingen library. So letters that researchers in the time of Enlightenment exchanged. And they were visualizing the geospatial Verteilung, where people actually were located. So I thought they come with data like this, and how do we embed this? Oh my God, and we have PDFs, so what do we do? But they were actually struggling so much with the content of their text that they came with this. So and this is a graphic from their research environment, but it's embedded in a Word file, and that's a PDF. You can't read anything, I can't read anything, meaning we can't really interact with the research result that's behind this. If we go, and this is an example from Stanford University Press. It draws on 30 historic pictures of Grand Canyon. And you can only open it in Opera, in Chrome and another browser, and sometimes the server is down. And those are hints for me that for Stanford University Press, which is one of the more powerful and highly innovative presses, it's difficult to maintain something that is called a digital monograph in a stable digital form. And why that is the case, you can see here. So they develop not just citability for each text and each graphic, but a whole presentation framework with geospatial data mapped on this map. And to keep that together for a press, I'm glad that I'm just sitting there with my PDFs from reassembling the Republic of Letters. But this is what presses and researchers need to do, because this is the basic research to open the research process and the richness of humanities research to the publications. As we work with the DSpace repository, we are limited and free at the same time. We are an embedded press, and probably now you see why I wear these polka dots. This is this is a typical library product. It's repository software. And because it's repository software, we can basically put in, whenever the granularity matches with our data model, we can put in the data the way we want it. And we introduced, and we're really proud of this, article level metrics. For the time being, we do it manually, but this will be automated. And I think this is where the research in humanities is going to. Because the case that I just described, the book chapter in that book, that needs to be citable in itself. Because it's, the case of Andrea Lauser is completely different than the other articles in there. And here's another example that is not true, but I think this is a very good case of why, as embedded presses, we're actually fit for purpose when it comes to open science. So those are researchers working with mythologies, with the creation mythos, and they try to do it in an interdisciplinary way, and they look at what they do in various cultural areas. And they developed an approach to analyze a myth by bringing it down to smallest triangles of meaning. And they explained that to us, and we immediately understood the way that they break down their vast, complex body of research that actually makes that very research prone to something like database or micro-publishing. So I don't need to invent a full new platform for them, but they anyway have to completely encode everything that they do. They will have young and old researchers working in there, trying to work on their large research idea, but at the same time constantly have something like a spin-off of smaller research results that they will bring into this living handbook of mythology. And that living handbook, at the end of the day, is also just a really complicated editorial process. And when we explained to them, hey, there's something in place like OGS, they immediately got it and said, this is what we want. We don't want to send around versions via emails. So this is pretty straightforward, and as a library, we know how to organize this. As a publisher, you probably also know, and I know there's many commercial publishers immediately jumping on the power of OGS because it's cheap and you can start professional journals right away. They will be coming with encoded text, but also with pictures, so there needs to be something like the media management inside there. They will be encoding what they do, which means the material is already prone for being held in several kinds of indices because they, just through their own research idea, they are forced to treat the material in a totally systematic way. Not that humanities scholars haven't been totally systematic before, but now that they use digital humanities methods, their systematic is suddenly machine readable and brings in full new dimensions. And because we are an embedded publisher, we can't just follow along with their ideas, but we have to limit them and say, well, you get 3 options for another way of approaching the content, but you can't have 5 or 6 because then we don't have any menu points for you left. So by limiting the platform that we can offer to them, they have to break down their research in a way that is understandable and that is broken down into chunks that can be processed. If we, on top of what I have just described, had to do this in a closed access environment, we just wouldn't be able to do it. Because if you see what, and you are all familiar with this, whether you come from library or publishing side, just to organize the process that closed access nevertheless means perfect service for patrons and bringing it to them via hand server or SFX or whatsoever. This we couldn't do. So open access for us is the easiest, and the researchers that we work with immediately understand why open access and storing their data in a systematic, digitally readable way they immediately got it because they realized that they can combine their own data with existing knowledge, what Wolfram described this morning, knowledge that libraries have organized and opened to the public for decades and hundreds of years. So, to wrap up, challenges for small presses, full dimensions of open science. Because we're so close to our researchers, they think we can make anything possible, and often that's magic wishful thinking, because at the end of the day we have limited resources. We think we need to move to single source publishing, at least for some fields, which means based on XML to be able to generate various versions. We definitely need to make enhanced publications come true, but we can take baby steps, the ones that I described. If we are embedded, like we are, we need to serve all our patrons at the university, which means I can't just dedicate all my time to the humanities scholars with the most interesting projects, but I need to be there for the entire university. And we do need to improve the range and the impact of all publications, because at the end of the day, researchers are measured against the impact of their publications or their research results, and that is happening on a market that is highly competitive. And we're paid by the taxpayer, so I have to be accountable what I do. And maybe we don't create the most impressive gardens, but I think that our role as an embedded press is to make urban gardening possible, to organize the processes and to make sure that the resources in place. And I want to close with some words from Jean-Claude Guédon. Open access is simply a way to express the cross-fertilization of the very culture of science with new technologies to create the optimal communication system science needs. And this, I think, is a way forward for humanities to work with embedded publishers, very close to research, but at the same time work with commercial publishers, because many of the technologies or the approaches that I presented today can be adopted by anyone tomorrow. Thank you.
So I think we'll move straight on to Mark's presentation, and then we'll still have time for more questions after that.
Hi, I'm Mark Zadrozny. I'm an executive publisher of Humanities and Social Science journals at Cambridge, but in the New York office. I want to thank my fellow panelists and Matt for inviting me, the organizers, and especially the technical crew that really helped me today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about creating a preprint server for the social sciences. But before I talk about the preprint server, which sits on what we call a Cambridge Open Engage. It's a collaborative open research platform that we're currently developing with the research community. The platform is going to host early research outputs, such as preprints, conference posters, presentations, as well as other types of open content. We plan to incorporate content uploaded directly to Cambridge Open Engage by both individual users as well as content through partner sites across multiple disciplines. Our first partner is the American Political Science Association, and we had been thinking about creating this Open Engage. They got our attention because they put out an RFP for such a thing. Now, we've been publishing the journals of the American Political Science Association since 2002. We've had a long partnership with them, doing a lot of different work. So we created it with them. This is the actual homepage for the APSA preprints. But in addition, to working with APSA, we thinking of other potential learned societies, departments, or centers within research institutions, as well as funders. APSA came to us a little bit before September of 2018, we signed a contract to work with them with the idea that the site needed to be launched by late August 19, end of August, beginning of September, at their annual general meeting. So we were able to announce that it was coming in February. We created a preprints panel, the early adopters launch in May, and then the main launch at the conference, and we have ongoing development and feedback on it. So what exactly is going on with the site? Well, its current functionality includes a straightforward author submission form, content checks for each paper or content item, links to final versions of record where appropriate, sharing tools, key metrics. Cambridge Open Engage APSA preprints is primarily for the research community, but it's accessible to all audiences because none of the content is behind a paywall, and it is free for authors to upload. They only have to register with an APSA ID. They don't have to be a member of APSA to get that ID, but that's how they would post their papers. I should tell a little more about it. The average turnaround time for the APSA moderation process, because they do look to make sure that the material is political science or related to political science in some way. It's been about 24 hours, but typically we're still allowing about 3 to 5 business days. So why did they want to build a preprint server? Why did they want to have one? Why did they want us to do it? What they said was that they envisioned this new platform as an opportunity to share working conference papers, increase public engagement through open access, provide a pipeline for journal submissions, and offer a new way to better serve our membership. One of the challenges that we were trying to solve in Open Engage to help us deliver our mission by supporting more openness across the research life cycle, disseminating the results of research quickly and directly while complementing the value added by the formal publishing process. Why are we working in this space? Did I already say this? Sorry, I'm mixing up my slides a little here. We're working in this space because scholars were still using informal tools around collaboration, and aspects of that collaboration is valuable, but it wasn't visible to other researchers. We're also seeing funder calls for more open forms of publication, critiques of traditional publishing venues from scholar-led initiatives, and growth of the sharing of preprints and other early research. We've had requests from some of our current publishing partners to work a bit further upstream, which we've now acted on. So the actual site itself, we don't really have as many papers as we had hoped initially. There's only, I think, about 85, 90 papers, but at the end of December, these were the preprint views we've had and the downloads on the material that is actually on the site. We're seeing strong engagement throughout the world on this. One of the things, how do we build it? What is different about how we're working to solve these problems? It's the thing about collaboration and interdisciplinary research through a process called co-creation. We're in a full experiment mode by launching with something very stripped back and delivering it further through the co-creation. We've used a user community on a platform. So, here we go. We have about 200 panelists called the Recollective. And it started as an exclusive user panel of political scientists for the APSA preprints, but it's grown already into other disciplines as we work to build out Engage. We work directly with the political science community via marker research and the user panel, and that all fed into the development of APSA preprints and social media engagement. So, here's an example of showing something that we were doing. Is it useful? Is it not useful? You have a question? The tasks for the panel also included feedback informing the content type options, the use of annotation and commentary both publicly and privately, the usability of the submission journey. We wanted to show usability testing of the submission process with heat maps showing where users would go to perform particular actions. Again, some examples of the panel commenting on us. This is an example of the heat map showing where users were going to perform particular actions. So we're now working with researchers through discussions, card sorting exercises, activities around our features. We try to ask questions, what's most useful for researchers in real time, so that we can get feedback on the prototypes as we mock them up. What this enables us to do is to solve a problem in a holistic way and not just from a publisher perspective, asking questions and opening up comments in free text. And we can generate ideas through the discussions. We have a variety of threads that researchers can start themselves. We're also engaging directly with user feedback after the release of development features through social media and a tool called Usabilia that allows users on Engage to share feedback. We're hoping that by taking an analytics-based approach to assist our decision-making process, we can speed things up and deliver more value. We've already made changes in response to our users, and we've also made our roadmap public. By opening up the roadmap to a larger audience, we hope we can increase the transparency of the development process, help us deliver a truly useful platform. Some of the things that we are working on right now with the APE preprints for early 2020 development include integration with a submission via Editorial Manager. There'll be likely two ways that this will happen: submission to an APE journal from APE preprints, as well as an easy deposit from submission in Editorial Manager to APE preprints. Event tagging to make grouping and searching content possible by conference. Looking at new ways to include commenting or annotation functionality that speaks to the nuance surfaced so far from political scientists to be able to engage with other researchers, but to overcome concerns around not wanting to critique someone's work publicly, not wanting their own work critiqued in public. They've told us that they're more interested in invited groups of commenting or direct comments to authors, but we need to understand this better and validate the shape the functionality takes. So this is sort of actually existing preprintism right now. And I just wanted to sort of close with a quote from one of America's presidents, FDR. During the beginning of height of the Depression, he said that bold, persistent experimentation is needed. It's common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it, and then try another thing, but absolutely try something. So, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to all of the three speakers that we had. We still have just about half an hour left in the session, and I think some of the best sessions that we've seen so far have had really good Q&A and debate elements to it. So at this point, I'd be really happy to take questions from the floor. If anybody has general questions or specific questions related to any of the presentations that we've seen. Liz?
Oh, thank you. They were really fantastic talks. It's Liz Marchant, Programme Coordination, Taylor and Francis. They were great, and it's fantastic to see, as you said, experimentation in progress and really getting down amongst the weeds of the content and actually what's needed for each subject discipline. My question is for each of you in turn. you will have goals, you will have aims from each of the initiatives you've described. Where does supporting, encouraging cross-disciplinary or multidisciplinary research come in? Because by opening up that process through the science disciplines, the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, it feels like it should be helping that drive towards, if you look at the funding streams, through the multidisciplinary power.
This is something that publishers have been, I think, always doing by asking authors and editors, what are the target groups? What are the markets that we can sell to? Can we just sell to political science or also to human geography, whatsoever? So this, I think, is something typical, and even in the digital environment and even in an open access environment, I think this is a crucial question that any publisher is anyway going to raise and say, what is your content meaningful for? Because we, for instance, as an embedded press, I have the obligation to serve my entire university, and if I tie myself up the entire year with a very interesting social anthropology project, I'm not open for anybody else. So it means I need to anyway raise the question, what's the target group? Whom are we serving, and how are we serving them best? That's one thing. And because whenever we start to experiment, we realize that for the mainstream, we don't really need experiments because options are in place already. And those who come to the experiments, that's my hypothesis, they are anyway at the margin of their field, almost in another field, so they are almost anyway interdisciplinary, and I think these experiments are a great playing field for interdisciplinary approaches, because there we can also say, you come with strange material, let me see if we can make it happen for you. You come with strange data, let me see if I can find a solution.
Yes, thank you for this very nice question. I think interdisciplinary is something that is certainly happening. It's part of our reality, but on the political level, we talk about interdisciplinary very easily, like this is a desirable thing to do, this is a goal, like going beyond silos and the like. And this is certainly how open science should look like. But we also have to admit that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of invisible work, also in terms of standardization. Sometimes even across humanities disciplines. So this is something, this is an area we are working on at DARIAH, like standardization. Questions like, can I run my tool on your data? Or the vice versa. So to establish like crossways, pathways across disciplines, it's investment in terms of standardization as well.
I think with the preprints and the Open Engage, we probably haven't thought as much as we should about interdisciplinary. We've identified a particular set of communities where we think, where we at the press are strong in publishing in and are trying to see how those communities feel about a preprint or doing something with Open Engage. There is a possibility with some similar to the event tagging that we can link things together in some way, but it's a good question and it is something surely that we should think of. On the other hand, you don't want the thing to turn into a bucket journal where there's so many different things. There has to be a connection in some way that's useful to a researcher and to a reader.
If I may add that open access as such is the root requirement for interdisciplinary work, because we have been used, and I think this was a good way to organize it as libraries and publishers, to have the dissemination lines along subjects. And as soon as we have things open access, and at least the metadata open access, and maybe even the citations open access, we enable interdisciplinary approaches, and I'm fully with both of you that at the same time we need to maintain the chain of trust, and that chain of trust is usually rested within the discipline.
Thank you. Were there any other questions? And yeah.
Hi, this is Jignesh Bhate from Molecular Connections. Mark, this is a question for you. Thank you very much for the fantastic presentation. For preprints, always experimentation is great, but preprints always the question has been on ROI. And you also mentioned you got about 21,000 documents, which was not as much as you expected. So internally, how did you convince on what kind of ROI metrics are you looking at, and who actually owns the intellectual property on the Open Engage? Is it APSA or is it CUP? And what are the metrics you are looking at to see whether this is a success or a failure in future?
Okay, I think there were a lot of questions there. In terms of the intellectual property, it's the submitters have the choice of a CC BY license of their choice. Was another question, what do we determine as success, or?
Yeah.
Yes, how do you, how do you measure the ROI on this?
So there are a lot of my colleagues have different ideas of what success is on here. One colleague thinks that there should have been many, many more papers. And we've been exploring the idea of why there aren't more papers. Has there not been enough publicity? Has there not been enough marketing? Has there not been enough sort of any kind of connection? Is there resistance in the community? And we really don't know at this point. I myself, I'm not a trained political scientist. I'm a comparative literature person, and I'm a magpie. I work with a lot of different projects in a lot of different disciplines. My sense is that the community will accept it more. There's also the idea that it will be connected to the actual meetings, so that the papers for the meetings will be posted on it. That'll be a success, I think, because they'll have to post them.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? And I think one of the things that we talked about amongst ourselves was a bit around preprints and what are the potential barriers for humanities scholars. And I don't know whether the other panelists would like to reflect a bit more on that issue around why humanities preprint servers haven't taken off in the same way as STM.
Thanks for this excellent question, Matthew. This is certainly a complex issue, but I think at least partially it has to do with the epistemic cultures in the humanities. That is, the knowledge production itself so we don't have, or in many cases, we don't have like a distinct work on data that you just need to write up in an article, but the epistemological process is also happening in the text, in the argument, in the interpretation. And this is why like the resources we are working with, whether we call it data or not, are much more interlinked with the argumentation, the text itself. It's difficult, it's much more difficult to keep them distinct than in the hard sciences. So this is certainly one thing. And of course we can also talk about like critical mass adoption. While working with humanities scholars and advocating these things to them, what I see is that, so this is something kind of personal I had to learn in my job, that preaching about the value of preprints, the value of early sharing is one thing, but it's much more powerful if you show them examples, bring in champions, bring in fellow scholars who were brave enough to share their research, who were brave enough to post preprints, and show them what happened to them. Whether they lost their academic jobs, no. Whether they got more citations, more collaborations, yes. So I think one of the major barriers to overcome, I wouldn't call it resistance, I would call it fear. It's the fear factor that we need to work on to eliminate.
If I can come in from the infrastructural side, is most humanities scholars are really good in cleaning up their manuscripts for the publisher that they are actually going to work with. So the page that I showed you where the small society has just a web page and produces books, and I don't know how they do it, but they have no way of disseminating themselves. So scholars are they can suffer through quite a bit, humanities scholars. So they are used to cleaning up their manuscripts, but for a specific market and also for a specific format. So most of them are used to publish in books or in book-like journals, so printed journals coming in the form of a book, and sometimes even called a book, and having ISBNs and whatsoever. So for many of them, it's a fairly unusual thing to break down their way of thinking into digital units that are publishable in itself. And because they are not used to this, they are not used to believing that there's some chain of trust in there. So for instance, and I'm sure that my political scientists in Göttingen are not aware of a Cambridge University Press running a preprint server for the political science, because this is something that they will immediately understand. If a publisher with a reputation runs a preprint server, then it's not this kind of, it's up there in the web and then anybody can take my things and blah, blah, blah. We discussed this with our humanities scholars at length. Most of them don't understand open access because they don't even understand digitality, not because they are stupid, but this is not where they think that their peers will expect their publications. And we are in the middle of a cultural change for humanities, and it's going to happen. And it's going to be an incremental change, but the change is going to be radical.
Can I quickly add something to that? I think another issue is what I mentioned, the fragmentation and the diversity. So in the humanities, we don't have like an archive, a big container preprint service. We have smaller disciplinary ones. And sometimes what scholars really missing, the real benefit of sharing, is what we call the social life of data, or the social life of preprints. So since the landscape is fragmented, we have smaller silos of preprint servers. Sometimes they just don't see the critical mass, they just don't see the guaranteed presence of the audience. So they, instead of putting their research into a dedicated preprint service, they put it to Academia-EU or ResearchGate. This is a very, very permanent pattern we are kind of fighting against.
I do think that the community, well, APSA itself has admitted it probably shouldn't have called it APSA preprints, because there will be more than preprints on it, and preprints, you know, they're not even printed ever, so how are they called preprints? But I do think that there might be some work, there might be some possibilities initially around the edges of the kinds of things that humanities scholars might post. Perhaps a study aid, perhaps a particular lecture or something like that. I'm also someone at the press who always tries to think of the worst case scenario, and I've been saying, when we do open it up, in general, what about the person that wants to put their entire book that was rejected by Cambridge University Press, you know, as a humanities project on the preprints, on Cambridge Open Engage? These are all sort of interesting things, but I do think that, again, it's that humanities people want it completely finished. The idea that it would go out before is just a very foreign concept at this point.
Any other questions? Any other points people would like to raise? So I think one of the things that we were, again, talking about amongst ourselves was some suggestions or recommendations about what some of the publishers that we have in the audience could do progress open science, open research for the humanities. I don't know if one of you would like to add some ideas or some suggestions, recommendations.
When I showed you the example of the living handbook of mythology, that was a really interesting example for us. And I'm sorry, I might take a bit of a curve now to explain this. But our researchers, that is a funded research group, and they invested time and money into a commercial platform for their research. And their research is actually, for me as a social anthropologist, really interesting because they try to look at the cultural DNA of our own sense of identity, history, and origin by really looking at the very smallest units of myth that are possible. So anyway, I thought they have a really interesting idea, they have a really interesting research approach, and they had lost almost 2 years of research funding, half of a lot of money on a platform that wouldn't work for them, because they and their platform developers spent almost a year to talk across and not getting the point of the other. Because I'm embedded in a library and our platforms for electronic publishing are all DSpace and they are all developed and maintained in-house, our developers have trained me to work the way they want me to. Means I work with them in their agile development scheme. And they sit me down and say, no, you don't talk about whether you want that button left or right, or whether you want blue or green. You please talk about user stories. You talk about what do you think that you want. And because I learned that approach of saying, okay, this is what they want from me, because then they can sort of reach an economy of scale and I can work according to their requirements. And because I was trained in that, and my researchers, in that case of the Living Handbook, had a long, steep, suffering learning curve behind them. They immediately understood what I was offering to them and how they can bring that into their research. And this was a unique way of going forward. And I think this is something that we need more, that we find ways of talking to each other where we quickly understand the requirements of researchers, and researchers quickly understand the requirements of publishers, instead of saying, the publisher doesn't want it. But maybe the publisher simply can't do it, and the other way around. And I think this is, especially when it comes to digital humanities, this is something where we're in the middle of basic research. We're just at the start, even if it's been around for several years.
Exactly. So I can just second Margot's thoughts on it. As I mentioned in my talk, like these days, on the one hand, these days scholars are kind of struggling to align their increasingly digital research workflows with legacy publication formats. So finding ways to better align the research realities with the publication formats is certainly one thing. But I also mentioned that it's, and I think it's in line with what you just mentioned, that it's not necessarily a linear, process, that humanities scholars have certain specific needs or demands towards publishers, but it can also be like a bidirectional kind of exchange, especially in digital humanities. We have lots of services, tools that are useful for scholarly communication as well. But in terms of practicalities, let me just mention very practical items as well, and both has to do with metadata quality. Maybe it's not surprising that I mention this. So on the one hand, the first thing that I would like to mention has to do with the visibility of books and citability. So having DOIs on the chapter level, that's just to mention something very, very specific, is and could be even more a game changer in the context of the visibility and then exposing the value of scholarship in edited volumes, for instance. But metadata quality is part of parcel of scholars' everyday life. Also, if you think about like practical things that they are importing publication records to their Xenodo libraries, the question of how much metadata enrichment they need to do in their Zotero library, whether the HTML metadata is good quality enough to just press the button. This is a kind of thing, and also mentioning again digital humanities, I think it's important but also exciting to explore that these research communities are interacting with publications not only via the traditional close reading, that is like reading, but also like via distant reading. So the availability, and this is also in line with your point, the availability of metadata up to the abstract level is getting more and more crucial in their research. They are analyzing it, they're harvesting it, they mine it, they enrich it, they make entity recognition in it, they do all sorts of magic with that kind of data, because for them publications can be also framed as data. So if we could see more and more publishers and journals who provide at least their metadata, at least up to the abstract level, available for scholarly analysis, that could also be a super valuable addition to humanities scholarship.
I would just, Matt's original question also about, what can publishers do? I mean, we at Cambridge University Press, in regards to Open Engage, are fortunate that because of Cambridge Core, which is our own proprietary platform, we were able to build the functionality for the Open Engage and thus the preprint server off of our own platform, which, again, by having control of that, we were able to move faster in some ways. We're obviously a lot smaller than some of the large publishers, but in some cases we can be a little bit more nimble.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we still have a little bit more time. I don't know after yesterday whether, Arno, you want to catch up some time, or we have some more questions that I have for the panel.
I don't have questions right now.
No, but whether you would like some more time, or we can...
I think we can move on to the next session.
Okay.
The first time that we are in time.
Yeah. So with that, I'd just like to thank the three panelists for all the work they've done in putting together their presentations and for taking your questions. So thank you very much, everyone.